Some people live their whole lives without ever stepping outside the lines. Today's guest doesn't even believe the lines exist. Now, let me paint you a picture. He's run 2,000 kilometres from Cairns to Brisbane. Not once, but 5 times, raising millions for charity along the way. He's climbed to 8,300 metres on Mount Everest, driven by grit, stubbornness, and an appetite for the edge. He's represented Australia at 3 Paralympic Games, taking on the marathon and gone head-to-head with the world's best in triathlon at the Commonwealth Games. He's flown ultralight plane, he's conquered adventure races across continents, and even stepped into the ballroom spotlight on Dancing with the Stars, making it all the way to the semi-final. And when he's not breaking records or taking on the wilderness, he's built a thriving artisan chocolate business from the ground up. But maybe the wildest chapter of all, he set out to swim the English Channel, taking on frigid waters and relentless currents in pursuit of a record that had never been claimed. Every single one of these feats would be astonishing for any athlete. But Gerrard Gosens has done it all without ever seeing the start line, the finish, or even the path in between. Born completely blind, Gerrard has never let the world's expectations define his own. He's living proof that the only real limits are the ones we accept. This is the heart of why do you think you could do that? To celebrate those who say yes to impossible questions and then go out and prove what's possible. Gerrard Gosens, welcome to the show. Gerrard, we've known each other for a few years now, and I've always enjoyed catching up with you and listening to your stories because it's absolutely fascinating. And I want to go back on some of your early life to start with. So let's start at the beginning. What were your first memories of growing up, I guess, differently? And when did you realise that you saw the world in a way that most people never would?
I think for me, growing up in rural areas and being somewhat isolated, living on a farm, I thought it was quite normal to walk around the farm and every now and again trip up a step or run into a half-open door as a young kid. And it wasn't until that very first day at primary school where I realised things were very, very different. The teacher had a very innovative thought about burning out some of that nervous energy of the students being away from mum and dad for the first time. So teachers took us down to the oval, and there we're asked to do 2 laps to the oval, which was fine. I enjoyed running at a very early age, and off we went. And I could hear the giggling and laughter of kids around me. I thought it was sort of quite normal. And within the first probably, maybe sort of 25 or so meters, I hit this big wooden post, and that was a bit different because all the kids went around it, and I ran into it. And then I went running again and hit another one, and then went hit another one. So I found all 4 goalposts of the AFL posts at the end of the oval. It showed me that was very different to the students around me. And from there, I then had to, I suppose, not only work on the perceptions of my fellow peers, but also the teachers within the classroom. I was the youngest person to ever go to high school with a guide dog. I went through the state primary school system and state high school system. So, and being in a rural and regional area, it was very limited services. Not only obviously with back then there was me, my I suppose bane of life, my hatred in life was the manual typewriter that I had to use every day, dragging it to school, and it weighed 5 or more kilos for a little kid. So I'd drag it home in my school bag and put it there, and then obviously drag it to school. And then what was even worse, that moving into sort of through high school and through university, all the audio, all the textbooks were put onto audio cassettes. So you were dragging around a 5 kilo typewriter, and then maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 audio cassettes just so you could listen to the textbook.
So growing up, was there a moment or perhaps an influence that made you decide that you really weren't going to accept the limits that pretty much the world had set for you?
I think for me, it was at a very early age. My parents didn't sort of put me in cotton wool, and I'm pretty staunch on that, I suppose, particular moment, in the sense that my parents didn't say, "Hey, listen, you're totally blind. Don't go and ride a push bike." It was get out there and and give it a go. In the first few years, I started riding to school on a push bike by following the sound of my brother's bike. And what we do is obviously put that the old days of putting a bit of cardboard with a bit of peg on the spokes, so it sounded really cool. And I'd be able to I'd be able to follow his sound of his bike, and also because we had dirt roads, you could hear obviously the tires on the dirt road, and there was those times when the city council will come along and put extra dirt on the road just to grade it out, and we hated that because that made it soft dirt road. But outside of that, I think for me, at that point, I had to believe in breaking down those perceptions about, okay, well, here's a young kid who's totally blind. I had to begin on working about how I could develop those relationships within the classroom to build those teams to ensure that I could do maths, I could do physical education, I could do science, because often at times I'd have a person, the mates, uh, who would sit beside me and tell me what was on the actual blackboard, and then obviously developing that relationship with the teachers so that they felt comfortable about working with a young kid. And there was look, it wasn't all sort of chocolates and roses. There were some immense challenging moments, and at times it was the smallest things that made big differences. And one of those I remember, where we were given some homework to go home and write a short story. And I went home, and it was one of those nights where you write a story, or just that homework comes out, and I just loved the story. It just came to me, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And I was really proud of this short story that I wrote for my teacher. Went back the next day, and I was itching to go out to the front to give her my short story and show her how well I'd written that, her piece of homework. Anyway, came to my points, and I sort of went up to the front of the classroom whilst everyone's working and handed in my piece of homework, my short story. And she said to me, "Where is it?" And I said, "It's right there." She goes, "No, it's not." And I thought I picked up the wrong piece of paper. So I went back to my desk and I opened up the lid of my desk and fell around some papers and sort of grabbed something else, and thinking, well, maybe perhaps that's it. Anyway, I went back to the front and said, "Here it is." She said, "No, that's not it." And I was quite confused until I actually felt the piece of paper that I handed her originally. And in actual fact, I had handed her the homework. What had happened was, that night, I put the typewriter on correction ribbon, on white ribbon. So you could actually feel, you could feel the letters that were imprinted into the actual paper, but you actually couldn't see it. And you think I could write that same short story again? No chance. But it shows you that despite your best attempts, obviously those are I suppose, the facts of life, where things can and will go astray. And being totally blind, there are many facts of life throughout my life that have been there. And it's about that. I think when we talk about bravery, bravery is about that window of attitude. It's about making sure that we have a crystal clear picture of what we're trying to achieve. And I think bravery can be impacted by a window of attitude, and also the learned fears. We're born with three fears in our life, and that's it: the fear of falling, the fear of isolation, and the fear of noise. Every other fear is learnt. And I think for me, bravery, whilst they may be called bravery, I think for me also the other spectrum is not having those learned fears. So my parents didn't say, "Hey, listen, you're totally blind. Don't go and pick up the axe and help up chopping wood up." Sure, I found ways around doing it. Don't go mow the lawn because you're totally blind. I could feel the long grass, I could feel the short grass. I was always about contributing in my own special way.
Absolutely fantastic. So I want to move on to the sporting part of your life. When did you first fall in love, and why? Was it the competition? Was it the movement? Was it something else? Why did you fall in love with sport?
I think for me, it was a great vehicle to break down those perceptions. So at a very early age, for example, where it be AFL, I enjoyed running. I could hear where the ball was, and I think back in also the days of AFL, and the days of rural areas, what would happen is the parents would come down to the football ground and sit around in their cars at either end of the oval, and you'd have the smell of the hot dogs coming from the small kiosk. You could have the smell of the massage oil, the Denko rub coming from one part of it. And if a goal was kicked, people would toot their horns at one end of the oval. So I had a very, and also you could hear the pitch, you could hear the wind coming through the trees at one point. So there's all these pieces of sound which created a picture, my own special picture. And I was also then given a tagging role. So because I was fairly tall at a very early age, I was able to tag someone, just stick right next to him. And if the ball ever came near him, was just, hip and shoulder out of the way. So that was my participation. But my love was cricket. So I built my own cricket pitch, and I would actually have to bribe my brother to come and play cricket. So I would bowl at him. I would build the pitch where behind the stumps I'd have some copper logs put into the ground. I had some black plastic, so if I bowled and bowled and bowled, the ball would be caught obviously by the black plastic behind the stumps. I could collect them and go on. And I could also feel the white paint or red paint that was left on the stumps from actually hitting the stumps. So I knew how high up the actual stumps I'd actually got through. My love of sport at a very early age was I suppose to two reasons. A was a sheer enjoyment, but also was a great vehicle to break down those perceptions.
So, Gerrard, most people have barriers placed in front of them, or they come up against barriers. When you came up against barriers, what was your approach when you were faced with them each time?
I think we can either create our own barriers, or we can have those perceived barriers that people may imply upon us. But I think for me, there was a way of actually working with that and building teams around me to demonstrate that. For example, with AFL, okay, well, obviously I couldn't go and mark the ball, but I certainly become a tagger, and I could use my height and my speed as a runner as an advantage. In other sports, where it be, I suppose, cricket, I had my heights as a young kid. I had my pace, and also I had, for me, I was very much a thinking bowler as a young kid. I would also be sort of trying to visualize how and what I would be trying to do as a bowler. So there was always a way of finding out different ways of doing it and breaking down those barriers. And at times, it wasn't actually at times the participation. It was at times simply the communication or instilling the confidence in the person who potentially was creating the barrier as well.
So, early on, were there any setbacks? Were there times where you felt, you spoke about the three fears, falling, noise, isolation. Did you have any times in those early moments where you did have setbacks, and what kept you going?
I looked at there's not just setbacks then, there's daily setbacks. For example, growing up and learning obviously the love of running, I was reliant on guide runners, and you'd have your guide runners who may call in sick, who may have other appointments that have come up. There's a whole range, or they even could be injured. So even just reliance on a guide runner, or if uh, I suppose another example is one day that I was going to school, and as I said, I would follow the sound of my brother's bike. And my brother was sick and didn't want to go to, well, he couldn't go to school. And I said to my mum, look, I'll be right. I know the way. And because I'd ridden it every single day, it was relatively straightforward. It was only probably about 3 kilometres. And I knew the dirt road. I knew how to get there. And that was the only day outside. We right past a fire station, a rural fire station. And that was any day that there was a bloody four-wheel drive parked out the front, and I hit it front on with my bicycle. And I got to school, a bit bloody and a bit scratched up, and the teachers were quite surprised because, here I was bloody and scratched up, but I'd actually got there on my own. For me, it was about overcoming those challenges. And sure, as I said, had the cuts, the bruises, the bits of blood, but it was about recognizing for me that, success is a journey, never ever a destination. It wasn't going to stop with, one single point. You know, I never had a bucket list of I will run from Cairns to Brisbane 5 times, or I think as a young kid, my first ever major ultra marathon was from Rocky to Gladstone, just over 120 kilometres. I never had that on my bucket list. It was about the actual opportunities. For me, throughout my life, it's finding those different ways. It's, as you said in the intro, it's about looking outside the lines. And I often tell a story about when I raced at Yeppoon High School, and the school was 400, and I'd run around the oval hundreds of times. And over the years, European High School placed a lot of linemen able to mark out the lanes. And I went out pretty hard. My score was 400. Things are going well. I could hear the puffing and panting of students behind me. Got around to the 100-meter mark, same sort of lead. Got around to the halfway mark, same sort of lead. Could hear the puffing and panting of students behind me. This is where I gave it everything I had until I heard the yells and the screams of the crowd. Went through the finishing tunnel and across the line and completed the fastest 400 European High School had ever recorded. And I suppose quite arrogantly can say that time will never, ever be broken. And the reason being is because at the 205-meter mark, I took a left-hand turn and I cut right across the middle of the oval, through the trophy tent, and across the line and completed 400 in approximately 42 seconds. So it showed the students. It showed the students I was willing to try and attempt on something. B, can make a mistake, but more importantly, can laugh at my own particular disability. And that's something very important to recognize, is that every single person in the world does have a disability, whether it be being not so good at maths, not so good at spelling, being totally blind, whole range of reasons.
I recall one of your stories, Gerrard, where you got in trouble with the police at an early age.
Yeah.
Tell me that story.
My brother and I would go out, and as very similar to the bicycle on motorcycles, we would ride motorbikes around our property. And it started off in a Kawasaki 75 and moved up to the Honda XL125s and what have you. And I would follow my brother's motorbike around the property. And also at times I became very familiar with the property, whether it be rectangle or square shape. Anyway, we had to go and find some other property because we're doing some work on the actual property itself. So we went down the road. We knew that there was quite a bit of large of property available, and we went down there. I said to my brother, "Hey, listen, you ride the motorbike, I'll run beside the motorbike. We'll get down there. We'll ask if we can use the property, and it should be right." Anyway, we got down there and knocked on the door, and no answer. And typically, as sometimes weather happens, the ocean or the skies just opened up with rain. And I said to my brother, "Look, you jump on the back. I'll dink us home." Now we're riding on the side of the road, okay, not on the bitumen, on the actual dirt road. And I heard this car go past. Could hear the wet tires on the road. It pulled up, and there was a guy got out and walked up, and he was a policeman. And he obviously identified himself, and he said, "What are you guys doing?" I said, "Oh, we're just riding home. We're just getting out of the rain." And he said, "What's the serial number on the bike?" And I said, "I don't know where it is." I actually did, but I recognized that he didn't know that I was totally blind. He then asked me where my parents were, and he drove home and he booked me for everything under the sun, as in no peeling passenger on the wrong side of the road, yada, yada, goes on. Anyway, we got home, and my parents were well aware of what we were trying to do, and they knew that we weren't sort of skylarking on the actual highlight. We went from point A to point B to find some grass to ride on. And I went to the senior sergeant for talking to the next week. And not once during that conversation did he recognise that I was either totally blind as well. I walked in there with my mum, and here I was actually, as a young, rebellious little kid, trying to explain why I actually wanted to get back on the motorbike and get back out of the rain. And my mum's kicking me on the table saying, just be quiet, let him sort of have a talking to, because he also doesn't know that he's totally blind. So again, I think also we talk about, actually, I had a friend of mine who's in the US right now, which is called blind masking. And it's really funny. She's going on a tour of Cape Canaveral. And they're in a bus and they're doing a sort of a bus tour around the shuttle and what have you. And the guy on the bus is sort of saying, if you look to the right, you'll see such and such, here, and look to the right, whatever. And she's doing that, even though she's totally blind. And the reason being is because she's fitting in. She's trying to sort of assimilate in with sighted people. And I think for me, that's been part of my life, is trying to fit in. Because, for example, I will go about that's why I played sighted cricket, because I wanted to fit in with my sighted peers. That's why I played AFL, because I wanted to fit in my fellow peers.
But your trajectory has certainly not been a case of fitting in with some of the things that you've achieved and taken on. And I want to switch things up a little bit now, because You've represented Australia on some of the biggest stages. So, what does it take mentally, physically to get to that level?
I think for me, when I sort of turn my hand to my ultimate goal in life, well, not ultimate goal, but one of the goals I sort of stumbled into was when I was running from Cairns to Brisbane 5 times. They were the days of Cliff Young and Yanis Skouras. And I sort of thought, okay, well, let's give this go of running from Sydney to Melbourne. So I had the preparation through running from Cairns to Brisbane. I was ready to go. That year, I entered the Sydney to Melbourne Westfield Run. I had my team, I had the equipment, so I had some sponsorship. That year, they cancelled the Sydney to Melbourne Westfield Run. So I was left somewhat stranded. I could have quite easily sort of hung up the boots and thought, well, running from Cairns to Brisbane's pretty cool, uh, pretty major achievement for a young kid. But for me, I recognised obviously the journey would go on. I did some research into Paralympic Games. Was horrified. Was very much upset in the sense of what I saw and what I found out about what there wasn't in a sense of the Paralympic Committee. Asked to meet with a volunteer who was sort of a chairperson of the Paralympic Committee in Australia. There was just a very tiny honorary board. I sort of said to him, "Hey, listen, I want to establish the Paralympic Committee." I resigned from my job. I began the Paralympic Committee from my back bedroom with a laptop computer and a bubble jet printer and began the Paralympic Committee from there. As an athlete, working alongside that, though, was building that team. And I had to build a team of guide runners. So I had about 12 to 13 guide runners in my stable, and some were there for the hill reps, some are there for the recovery runs, some are there for competition. And those all play very different roles. And I think in all our teams of achieving bravery, we're going to have maybe the human resources, the physical resources, the financial resources. And I think bravery is about the ingredients we bring to the process. And bravery is both physical as well as psychological. And it's about the resources we bring to that bravery role. And it's about building those ingredients. And I built those ingredients through my team, both mentally and physically.
Let's talk about your guide runners and the team that you always have around you for a lot of these feats. Now, you are a bloody fast runner. What's your fastest marathon time?
240.
2:40. So for anybody who knows marathons knows that that's an extremely fast time. That's an elite time. Where do you find guide runners who can maintain the pace to help you in those marathons?
For me, I was my marathon time could have been quicker. The reason being is because I was actually sort of in Sydney 2000, I did the 5, the 10, and the marathon. So I was working on both at short speed over the 5K. I was ranked number 2 in the world for the 5K and then through to the 10 and the marathon. In a marathon, thankfully, I can use, if I want to, I can use 4 governors. I use 2. So they swap over. It's almost like the jets that are being refueled. They come alongside, they change over. And when I first got into marathon running, I had organized back, I think it was like 96, 97 Gold Coast Marathon. I'd organised 2 guide runs, and I'd organised one to run the first, obviously 20 odd Ks, and then obviously the remaining 20 Ks. Anyway, about the 4 or 5 kilometre mark, my guide runner broke down. He tore his calf, and I was somewhat left stranded. Anyway, what I did was though that all these people who were running past, I just gave them a short piece of shoelace and said, "Hey, let's keep running." So in between that sort of 5K mark and coming back through the start line, I ran with 8 different people until they were too exhausted and couldn't go on. And there was one point where I ran with a little dwarf. So it was, here's a guy who's 6 foot, so I'd ran with a little dwarf until he obviously got too tired and was short of breath, excuse the pun. And but I'd run with the highlight of my life obviously is Sebastian Coe. I ran the 400 with him. Pat Carroll I used to train with Pat Carroll, who's a Commonwealth Games representative. We would train every single lunchtime together. We do our double runs. So for me, I had the team in the morning and they had Pat Carroll at lunchtime, a very elite runner. But thankfully, in a 5 and a 10 and a marathon, I actually can have 2 different guide runners.
Righto. So now, if we talk about the first Paralympic Games, In that, is there a moment where you feel like you belong?
Yes, I think, and also what made me feel even more belonging is that I was, executive officer of the Paralympic Committee. So I'd seen where we'd come from and where we're going to go to. And also, when they say that you walk into an opening ceremony, that's a lie. You don't walk into an opening ceremony. In actual fact, you float. You're picked up by the sheer splendor of the 80 odd thousand people, and you float that lap. I think the highlight for me in 1996 in Lancer is I took, back then it was obviously we call it the brick or the big sat phones, with me. I was going to give some commentary back here to Australia on the opening ceremony. I took the phone into the opening ceremony, and I was giving some commentary back. I had a friend, one of my board members, worked for ABC Radio, and I called Vicky up and I said, "Hey, listen, Vic, I'm here at the opening ceremony." She's like, "Hang on, we'll put you straight through." Went through on the ABC Radio and was working with her on ABC Radio 612 4QR. The For the next, well, maybe sort of anywhere some 45 minutes or so, I did some live broadcasts of the Atlanta 1996 Paralympic Games. Not one person called up the studio and said, "How the hell is a blind person describing the opening ceremony?" And reason being is because I wasn't necessarily describing the color of the uniforms. I was describing the feeling. I was describing the moment, and they were all captured in by what I felt and what I brought back to them as listeners through the actual radio. Because listening to radio, you don't need to see; it's about what you feel.
Yeah, love that. Now, I want to carry on that feeling and so the senses because I want to talk about Everest. Now, climbing to over 8,000 meters on Everest, it's beyond most people's comprehension. So, what was it that drove you up the mountain? Why did you want to do Everest and why got you getting up there?
So I was helping out a charity way back before 2003, and I was speaking at a function. I met Sue Fierce. She was the first Australian to summit Everest. Also, Michael Groom was there, and a couple other pretty significant mountaineers. Anyway, I was offered the chance to go to Everest Base Camp in 2003 and beyond. Sort of, yeah, took on that was either Everest Base Camp or the Kokoda Trail. And I thought, well, the Kokoda Trail is something that is very achievable. I see very approachable, being so close to Papua New Guinea. Everest Base Camp, very different story. Anyway, so building that team and building the preparation around that, I had, we talk about fears. My fear on Everest wasn't um, the trust in my team, wasn't the trust in my equipment, wasn't my fear of the cold. My biggest fear on Everest was my aim. And I mean, when Mother Nature takes hold and you have to dig that little hole and hope like hell your aim is very good as a blind person. Otherwise, you could be in a lot of problems. But for me, I came back from Everest. I did a recce. I recognised obviously the opportunities of climbing Everest. I've heard obviously about various other climbers to climb Everest. And I think climbing is a very different game, I suppose, in a sense of its isolation. And back then, there wasn't a lot of technology around, obviously, energy cells. There wasn't a lot of comforts around staying on Everest Base Camp. When you get to Everest Base Camp, you think, oh, there's going to be a sign. You can have your photo up against something. There's no sign there. It's just all rock. And it goes for kilometers of just rock upon rock. And the balance and the coordination for a blind person is an immense challenge because there's not 1 ounce of level ground that you actually can relax on. It is always a test of endurance, both mental and physical.
It when you see photos of base camp, it looks just inhospitable. It looks like hell to anybody. Moving around base camp and then starting your climb, how much effort does it take mentally, physically for you to move around what looks like a war zone?
Yeah, I think also too that when we take two sort of steps here is that, yeah, look, the base camp and then moving up through the ice fall. all that sort of stuff. I think obviously the rocks were harder than the actual ice wall. Climbing Everest isn't necessarily a difficult and most challenging mountain because obviously you have your ropes, you have your crampons, you have the ladders. There's plenty of lines which you can follow. Whereas Everest Base Camp, again, it's just all rock. And I remember, I think it was Camp 2, where we were situated. I was in my tents and we had a line that went from my tent to the actual taller tent. You dig a hole and they put a tent over it. Anyway, it came the night and I sort of, okay, I need to go to the toilet. It got out and I followed the rope over to the toilet tent. And in that time, there'd been like a small avalanche, and it covered over the actual rope itself. It went from the toilet tent to my tent. And because of the winds, I was out there for over an hour trying to find my way back to my tent because the rope had obviously been destroyed or taken away. And no one could hear me because of the actual wind. So that was some very tense moments for me because I had no whether I was going to step off the mountain or into a crevasse or go the wrong way. I eventually got there, but it was about having that confidence in my skills and patience in what I was trying to do that. But Everest is uh, eh, I always talk to exercise physiologists about. We talk about the carbohydrates that we burn off in running, swimming, cycling, playing golf, playing footy. There are also, I believe, emotional carbohydrates, as in you might walk from your kitchen to the lounge room, and if I'm in the same house as you, you might consume 10 emotional carbohydrates, the conscious and unconscious ones. I might use 35 because being totally blind, I have to be more aware of my surroundings. It's like being in the pool. I tested out our swim coach today. For the first time, our swim coach jumps into the water and he put the blindfold on. Now, he was in a straight line, swimming 50 meters with a guide swimmer. All the way along, he was either hitting the guide swimmer or he was running into the lane road. He thought he was going in a straight line. Now, he was using up a lot of emotional carbohydrates, trying to sense out where he was. I become obviously proficient with that, but I still use up far many more emotional carbohydrates. So when I travel to a new hotel room, when I travel to a new location, even just walking in a plane from my seat in the plane to the toilets, I'm using far many more emotional carbohydrates than a solar person does.
Uh, Absolutely fascinating. Now, on your Everest climb, was there a point where you just go, this is enough, or can we just keep pushing?
There was one point there where we had a changeover in Sherpas, and one of my Sherpas led me into a crevasse which dislocated my shoulder. And that was bad. But the good thing about that was that, well, not the good thing about it, but I suppose the thing I recognized was that he had forgot that I was totally blind. He saw me as a regular climber. We had a we talk about the small differences in life that make big differences, and the small difference on Everest was the yak bell, which I bought for $5 off a person up halfway up this trek from Lukla to Everest Base Camp. And that $5 or that yak bell was tied to my fellow climbers' backpack. It saved their voice, it saved my voice. It was consistent, reliable communication, and that's what's essential in any form of a team. And again, in any form of how we view things. I think when we talk about bravery, bravery might be seen as a perceived result of achieving something. But I think in some respects, what you see as bravery, I may see as something very different because you might think, oh shit, you're totally blind. That's pretty brave to go and do that. Well, no, it's not because it's something that I've lived with my entire life. So it's something that is second nature. Whereas I might see something that you do as incredible, like, maybe going doing the high hoops or the up on the big tents and jumping from trapeze to trapeze. That may be seen, I do it every day. It's just like going to the park. Our perceived thoughts of what bravery is are two very different things.
And I guess, Gerrard, you and I both, we, I guess, tend to escalate in our Feats. One of my favorite sayings is, when you get to the top of your mountain, find a bigger mountain. And you learn through your past. As you do more, you achieve more. You just go, oh, well, I didn't think I was capable of doing that, but I did it. Now let's go and find something else that's a little bit bigger. Is that how you approach all of the things that you attempt?
And I think for me, Sam, it's like, even if you talk about that, depends what you see as a mountain. So, for example, I'd never danced in my entire life. And when I got the call saying, "Hey, listen, Gerrard, we're thinking about obviously auditioning you for Dancing with the Stars. How do you feel about that?" Well, I'd never danced a step in my life. Um, I had no idea about it. I never even watched the show Dancing with the Stars. But for me, it was, yeah, okay, look, yes, let's give it a go. Let's see how far we get. Even if I get, through the first series or first, whatever show, that's an achievement. To get to the finals was massive, and I think the reason why we got there wasn't that I was a good dancer, was other ways we brought to it, which was the story of that journey along as a dancer. So, for example, in all of that, so it could be in the lifts. Jessica and I designed various unique lifts throughout the process. So the audience enjoyed those particular stories or parts of the story that we brought to the actual dancers. So the mountains that I've climbed, both mental and physical, haven't been gone, I will set my sights on that. They've been all about the opportunities. So, for example, I never said to myself, I will swim the English Channel, because as a kid and as a runner, when I was at University of Queensland living in Emmanuel College, I would run past the pool at 5 a.m. going, "Look at those bloody idiots." Like, they're in the pool. I could smell the chlorine coming and wafting across um, the actual river part there, and thinking, my God, why would you be in a pool at 5 a.m. going up and back, up and back? Why would you be out there on the road listening to the birds and the trees? Well, here I am in the pool, 3 a.m., doing 6 kilometers and sometimes 10 kilometers in the pool. And things change, because change is constant, growth is optional.
I've done a couple of training sessions with you at Urongapilli in squad, and your squad starts so damn early. It's ridiculous. I have to have a nap after I go because it's that early. I've always wondered, it's a 50-meter pool. How do you know when to turn? How do you know when to stop?
Well, as I said to Philippe, the coach, this morning, like I said to him, what were you doing? Because he was sort of over the shop, and he said, "Oh, I was trying to guess, or sort of use my stroke count." I don't count strokes, because even the slightest of changes in angles would mean a shorter stroke or a longer stroke. I listen to the water, so I wear a snorkel, and I listen to the actual depth of the water. And now that's why, for example, swimming at Chandler swimming pool isn't necessarily I'm going to go and do, because the water level there is consistently deep all the way through. So I use the snorkel to listen to the water, not count my strokes, and that way it gives me some idea where I am. And it's the same in the ocean. I can use, for example, when you come, if you I swim it down at Kurrawa, sometimes it will go from Kurrawa up to surface and back. And there are certain points along there where there's some cold channels that you swim across, and okay, well, that gives me some idea of where I am, because a sighted person can look at the towers or the high rises, and they get both the conscious and unconscious reinforcement of how well they're doing or not doing, but also how far they've progressed. For me, in those moments where we could be swimming into a current, and we think, like, for example, at Talabudra on the weekend, we were just on a treadmill. And thankfully they told me, because we were just, we were salmon fishing. It was just the current was that strong. We were going nowhere, but it was all about the training. So for me, Everest, Dancing with the Stars, flying a plane around Queensland 3 times, all those things weren't, I must do them. Life isn't a dress rehearsal right now. For me, it's about, okay, if a person came to me and said, "Hey, listen, Gerrard, would you like to do such and such?" My wife is terrified, because she knows I'll say yes. And as it was with the as there was with the channel. When I had a person who said to me, "Oh, there's never been a totally blind person swimming the English Channel," you should think about it. Well, I jumped at it, and obviously that progression was I was the first person to swim around Great Keppel Island, um, and then it moves on.
Before we jump into the English Channel, you speak a lot about your senses and feeling so much, hearing so much. I've never heard anybody talk about Everest in terms of smells. Are there any smells up Everest?
Oh yeah, there are. Well, when you trek from Lukla up to Everest Base Camp, you get a whole smorgasbord of smells. Not just the um, they use yak poo, yak crap, as a sense of as a source of fuel. So they burn the yak poo in drums to heat things and just to cook things. So the smell of that's pretty off the charts. And then you have the smell of obviously the various locations, the rivers, the snows, the smells that are coming through the actual mountains. Would be the dampness, the coldness, so there are many, many different smells, and then you've got the faint little sort of villages, the smells of cooking, be the lentils or the they make some really great hot chips up there. Uh, so yeah, I think as a runner and also as a climber, when you're running around the streets of Brisbane or where it may be in winter, you can certainly pick up all the smells coming out from the various houses of like even just yesterday, I went for a run and they're having a barbecue, or they've got some pizza, or let's call in there. They've got some the burgers that you can sort of there's the smell of running past people's houses again is like that. Oh, okay, that's what they're having for dinner. So it's and people like if you go to Yeronga swimming pool. Across the way there is the Wheat Bix factory, and even this morning, the smell from the Wheat Bix factory that wafts across the a pool is pretty intense.
Oh, I'm hungry. I could actually go some Wheat Bix right now. Now let's move on to the English Channel. 2024, you attempted to become the first totally blind person to swim the English Channel. There's no reason asking you why. Why do you think you could do that? Because I think we've got a pretty good sense. Well, let's see what happens in undertaking a task like that. I know as someone who can see who's swum the English Channel, there's a lot of organisation that goes into an English Channel attempt. How much organising was there for you to firstly attempt this?
Oh, look, there's the national as I think the same retrospect is for even for marathon running, because at times it's not the race or it's not the swimming across the channel that's the hardest. It's the day-to-day training. It's the day in, day out training. It's not even turning up at the pool at 6 a.m. It's even just getting to the pool and transport. It's actually having that accessibility of whether jumping a taxi or getting a ride, or even going out into the coast, for a long swim, and making sure that your guide runners are, guide swimmers are available, um, and then it's the whole coordination of okay, well, who is available to swim, what's their skill. So, for example, each of my 4 swim guides, which are coming with me, all had their own set of skills, and I'll use them. And those were the lessons learned from last year in swimming the English Channel. Is that I now know what I need to do with the currents and also the timings of how I use those guide swimmers in crossing the channel or swimming around Manhattan Island.
So let's talk about your 2024 attempt on the English Channel. Where did the wheels start to fall off?
Oh, look, the wheels didn't fall off for me. It was actually the change in weather and the change in currents, and also the way in which the boat was zigzagging across the water. It's quite evident that we have a radar picture of the boat only had one engine, whereas respectively should have had 2, and also had a very large donga attached to the back, which was affecting the balance of the boat. So it wasn't just I suppose the weather. There was other things which contributed to the actual just like if I had last year when I finished and was to pull out 3K short, I was I hadn't realized how far we'd actually gone, because for me I wasn't concerned about the distance. My goal, my psychology was Okay, I had 6 swim guides last year, and for me, it was just rotate them through. Okay, Hayden's number 1, sort of, and went through the whole process of where they were in the actual pitch of the guy swimmers. When they told me I swum the 40K and the channel was 34, I was quite pleased in the sense that, okay, we actually swum the distance. It wasn't necessarily getting from point A to point B. Well, we're bloody close. So I know from a distance perspective I can do it. It was now finding the right pathway. So as in life, we might be disrupted, and that pathway may be, for example, it could be that the running club we're with isn't necessarily suited to us. It could be the gym we're going to doesn't necessarily have the right equipment. It could be the fuel and nutrition that we're using isn't necessarily the right pathway. And for me, the mechanics of the boat and the way we attacked it weren't the necessary pathway. And we now have a new pathway because the lessons we learned from 2024.
The moment that you called an end to that swim in 2024 at 31 kilometers, 3 kilometers off the French coast, what state were you in physically at that point?
I was actually in great state. I was actually going for it. It wasn't like we were just going nowhere because the currents and the Mother Nature had changed. The chop was significant. The documentary, I think, even highlights how bad the chop was. Like there was points where, the boat was down one side and we were up the other side. So physically and mentally, I was quite, I suppose, good, well in how I felt. It's just that we weren't going anywhere. We were sort of swimming on that particular treadmill, and I've experienced that before. As I said, on Talabudra Creek, where when the river's going out or in at Talabudra, you got no chance against some of those tides.
So, who made the call to end the swim?
The pilot does. The pilot makes a call. I don't have a chance. It's like I would have kept going. In actual fact, if I had my choice, I would have gone further south and then turned back and gone back in with the other tide. So I was prepared to swim. We were pulled out at 14 hours. I was prepared to go to 22, 23, 24 hours.
Righto. Now, the sense of having the swim ended on you must have been pretty disappointing. What does it take to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and just go, bugger this, let's do it again?
Sam, I think for my entire life, I've actually, I've encountered those, I wouldn't call them disappointments, but where, I've gone into a race. Yeah, and I've raced against able-bodied athletes who have far many, like even for example in triathlon, para triathlon, I raced against people who basically could almost drive a car. There's 3 classifications: B2, B3, B1. I'm B1, which is totally blind. So I've raced against my fellow peers in many different situations, and we'll be finishing second, third, fourth, whatever it may be. But for me, it's not necessarily about the actual the medal, which I've obviously won many medals, but it's been about the entire journey. It's been about the whole process of the journey and what have I learned, what have I taken from it, what have I achieved. Now, with the channel last year, swimming 40K, because obviously it wasn't a straight line, I knew I'd cover the distance. If I had been done 10K or 12K, sure, would have been disappointed. But to swim further than the actual distance of the channel, I was pretty proud. I still went about obviously looking at a different slot. I waited for a slot. There was no slot available until one's actually just come up. And the process was to swim around Manhattan Island, which is a 50K swim around the 20 bridges. Far more less weather affected than what the English Channel is, and somewhat more comfortable than what the English Channel is in the sense of water temperature, but still an immense challenge. And if you had said to me 5 years ago that I'd be swimming 50K, Sam, I remember when I used to go to pool, my running coach, and we go to Dunlop Park swimming pool, and we'd swim a kilometre, and we would think we were so good. We would think we have just swum a kilometre. And then we go there after a while and we swim 2K. And we would think we were the bee's knees because as runners, we'd swum 2K. 2K isn't even a warm up for me in my sessions these days. It's just how we have that change and that growth in our own both mental and physical opportunities.
Yeah, runners certainly don't make the best swimmers, do they?
No, because they hate it, because they're used to going from they're used to going from point A to point B. They're used to running from, running from here to the city and back again, My wife and I, we used to walk into the city and see a movie and walk back again. That's a 12K round trip, actually further. So, we just love that point A to point B of all the sights and sounds, sights for obviously sighted people, but the sounds and the different undulations, the road textures, the grass, the pavement, the bitumen. Whereas in the pool, it's just up and back. And for me, it's taken on a different psychological state of, okay, how do I prepare myself mentally? Because in the ocean, Sam, you can see the next buoy, you can see where the boat is. I get no reinforcement, I get no psychological rewards, subconscious or unconscious, um, because I can't sit. So in my mind, I have to work on the things that I know, which will get me through the 1 hour, the second hour, the third hour, the fourth hour, and I'll break it down into half an hour. Often the question is, how do you eat an elephant? We eat it one bite at a time. You don't look at the entire elephant. You take those small pieces in the whole process.
So, on that, you've danced live on national TV. You started a chocolate company. You seem to reinvent yourself a lot, runner, swimmer, climber. Uh, where does that drive come from?
I think for me, it's purely about knowing that I can. I can turn up my grave and you're all sort of ragged and done in and tired and exhausted. I'm not going to turn up there sort of all rested and prim and proper. For me, it's about recognizing those opportunities. And I think as a blind person, I've always had to take on those opportunities because, for example, Sam, you can sit down and watch a documentary of Everest, all right? You can sit down and you can watch a documentary of a person swimming the English Channel. What do I get out of watching that? Nothing. So I'd rather experience it. I'd rather actually go there and feel the rocks and feel the coldness of the English Channel because you can see it um, through those documentaries or pictures or magazine articles, whatever it is. I don't get to do that, and I will take on any opportunity where I can experience. So I suppose another good example is that it took me 25 years to realize that an elephant was hairy because I go into a shop and pick up a statue of an elephant and there wasn't 1 ounce of hair on it. It wasn't I went to the circus, had a chance to ride an elephant. And it's like mounting a major scrubbing brush, one of the hairiest beasts I've ever come across in my entire life. And it opened my eyes, excuse the pun, to obviously my perceptions of what an elephant were and what they actually are. And it's the same with what I thought, for example, Everest Base Camp would be like. Like I thought I was going to get to Everest Base Camp and there's going to be a bit of a sign there and maybe even a little kiosk. I could buy a little drink and have a photo beside a sign. There's nothing there. There's just rock. It's like going to a quarry and running on rocks. That's something I never experienced and never thought about. So I'd rather experience those opportunities and reinventing myself is about, okay, well, what's that next chapter? Because our life is a book and we need to obviously work out what chapter we're at and what that chapter may look like. And sure, the paragraphs may be long and descriptive, and there'll be some chapters which are just one sentence. Yeah, I was here.
Is there a common feeling or a buzz that you get from all of these challenges?
I think for me, the it's about creating a pathway, Sam. I think for me, I saw the challenges I faced as a young kid in coming through sport and through education and through work. And for me, if I can create those, like there's some young kids who I mentor that are um, disabled, whether it be from vision perspective and other disabilities. And for me, it's about creating those pathways, about those opportunities. So that, for example, the swim tether that I've designed, people now use my swim tether not just here in Australia, but around the world. They now have guide runners. I talk about, and this may not sound significant, but in many ways it is, that when I first started off swimming down to the Gold Coast Open Swim Club, and I went down with my first swim guide, and everyone was like, oh, she's a blind person, all this sort of stuff, a bit nervous, what are we going to do? That was 2 years ago. There's a photo at the Christmas party at the Christmas swim, not last year, the year before last, and there's a photo in that group just before the Christmas function, before the swim. Every single person is wearing a swim tether, and reason being is because they all wanted to be swim guides. They all wanted to swim next to a blind person because they knew they enjoyed it. They knew about the opportunities, and it went from zero to every single person in that photo wanting to become a swim guide. And that's where, if a tourist comes to the Gold Coast who is blind or has low vision, or a person wherever it may be, they have access to the opportunities, because whilst the ocean is accessible, in many respects, it's inaccessible as well.
Isn't that fantastic? Look, you're an advocate and a motivator for so many. Have you got a core message that you would give to anybody who feels like they're up against the impossible?
Oh, look, I think, obviously I talk about, success is a journey, never a destination. And secondly, I think that, if you think you're too small to be effective, you haven't been bitten by a mosquito, in the sense that we all can play our small part. And I look back now and I see people now, where I've spoken at schools or Rotary clubs or other events, and people come up and say, "Oh, hey, listen, Gerrard, you changed my life through those particular words or that particular story or that particular learnings." And that's a real privilege, is the sense that those people now have, I've contributed to their book, their life. I've helped them add a chapter or add a paragraph or add a sentence. And because they've actually been able to do that, because maybe perhaps they now have a guide runner, because their guide runner is now more comfortable about running with them because they've run with me. Yeah.
When you hit setbacks, is there a mantra? Is there a mental tool that you use to get through?
I think for me, Sam, it's about looking at, and I always had to. I always had to look at those ways around, whether it be over, under, uh, around the side, where it may be. There was every part of my life is about doing that. For example, what's a good example? Like, for example, when I used to carry the cassette tapes, to school, that was a massive challenge because, let's say, for example, I've got them all in order, and you drop my school bag, or a kid kicks it along the pathway, by accident. All the cassette tapes are out of order. And back in those days, if the heat affected it, if it was a sunny day and the actual ribbon of the audio cassette would start to melt. So there was always those. There's never been a moment like, I suppose I had to be comfortable in being uncomfortable, because that was the only way I had to break down the perceptions and try and achieve something. Because being totally blind, you have to be very uncomfortable. For example, going into a loud environment, you imagine going into a loud hall, being totally blind, you've got this implosion of sounds and giggles and laughter and talking and screaming and all that sort of stuff. Well, I had to be uncomfortable in being comfortable. Um, so yeah. So I had to be comfortable in being
So,
uncomfortable.
yeah, I love that feeling. And it's one of my mantras as well. I think I get a lot of pleasure from feeling uncomfortable. And when I feel uncomfortable, that's when I feel comfortable. Now, Gerrard, today, you're such a great storyteller. How do you use your stories and how do you present your stories to show others what's possible?
I think for me, I don't work to an actual, when I go up there and talk at a major conference, I don't talk to us as a written script. I talk from the heart. So I talk from my experiences and their lessons learned, and it's the truth. It is something that has always been there, and will play a part in everything I do, not only now, today, tomorrow, next week, and the various teams that I built along the way. And even, for example, my teams, being a chocolatier, I make a great ganache. I make some great ingredients and stuff within the desserts. And my other staff who have the skills in doing the decorating, that's their job. It's all part of the team process. And when I swam the English Channel last year, it wasn't Gerrard Gosens, it was my team, as it will be, this year, in a challenge. And when I ran from Cairns to Brisbane, I had a team of, 35 soldiers from one signal regiment. It wasn't just Gerrard Gosens, it was Gerrard Gosens and one Sikh from Enoggera Barracks who were there on that journey.
Now, we're going to move on to the signature part of the show, Gerrard. The show's called Why Do You Think You Could Do That, as you know. You've done so many things that would intimidate most people, whether they're sighted or not. Why do you think you could do that? Everything that you've done?
Belief, and also the belief, and also exposure to those opportunities, the pleasures of, or the rewards of seeing a difference, in making a difference. And I know as a young kid, when I would go out there and whether it be play sport or um, contributing back to the community, it was about making that difference, and may not been uh, necessarily to a large group. It could have been just the person next to me. And if I was making that difference, fantastic. I think for me, as a business owner of a team, when my staff leave work, I would hope that the lessons they've learned is that there are many more ways. For example, I'll change my recipe regularly on a chocolate. And the reason being is because every environment we face in our bravery pursuits requires a different recipe. So, for example, at the beginning of season, I might use 200 grams of strawberries. At the end of the season, I might be using 450 grams because strawberries are weaker, less intense. So I need to use a stronger batch. So my recipes will always change. And as it is with bravery, we'll need to bring into our armory of bravery a whole range of different ingredients depending on the actual conditions and what we're trying to achieve.
You've spoken a lot about bravery through our conversation. What does bravery really mean to you?
I think bravery is about achieving those perceived learned fears, and also the bravery is about taking that next step. That next step is people can, as I said very early in this podcast, is that I could have after 5 times running from Cairns to Brisbane gone, shit, that's good. I've run from Cairns to Brisbane 5 times, 154 k's a day in some bloody tough conditions where at times it was 30 or 40 degrees. Sometimes running up the Carwell Range and getting to Gympie and through Mackay, Mount Pleasant there, all hard stuff. But bravery was taking the next step, because we all can sit down on the couch, we all can stand still thinking, well, that was good enough. But the next step is about the bravery. And the bravery is the next step, as you said very early, was picking out the phone call to make that call. Bravery for me was asking a person to become a guide runner, to become a swim guide, and teaching them and placing my trust. Trust is also about, or bravery is also about trust as well. Because without the trust, I could not complete any of the things I've done. The trust in my dance partner, the trust in my team and the business and my chefs, the trust in anybody who I work with. And that's about bravery. It's taking that next step of that trust in that relationship.
So, thinking about your life so far, is there a moment that sticks out in particular where you've needed bravery the most?
Yeah. As a father, um, when my daughter was born, I have a son and I have a daughter. And when my daughter was born and she was placed in the little crib there because my wife had a cesarean section, so I got to feel my little baby whilst they were looking after her. My daughter, with her little hand, grabbed my finger and pulled it closer to her face. I recognized there was a problem there. I called out the doctor, who was just obviously tending to my wife, and he looked at her eyes and said, "Yes, I appreciate there is a problem with her eyes. I believe so. She has a fairly significant vision impairment." Um, I almost fainted, and reason being is because not that I was saddened that she had a vision impairment. My fear, or my next step in bravery, was learning how to assist a girl who is blind. Because as a blind guy, I knew the tricks of the trade. When you walk into the men's toilets, you can listen to where the urinal is, you can listen to where the toilets are, you can listen to where the taps are. You develop that mental picture of what's in the toilets. For a female, had no idea about makeup. I have no idea about, women's health issues. What happens when it comes to periods and all that sort of stuff. How does she put makeup on? How does she choose her clothes? How does she make sure her bag matches her whatever? How does she choose jewelry? All that sort of stuff I had no idea of. So I'd been through this world of my learned experiences as a male. Now the next step was, my God, what do I do as a father of a girl who now can't see? And so the bravery was obviously taking on those challenges of learning those experiences, which I could then share with my daughter.
Your daughter's sight impairment certainly hasn't slowed her down, hasn't stopped her from achieving some great things. In fact, she represented Australia last year in judo at the Paralympics, and the two of you had a beautiful moment at the start of the Paralympics. Tell me about that.
Yeah, look, we obviously from the taking across the Australian flag, we swam across the English Channel with the Australian flag and took it to the athletes' village. So that's where Taylor was, at the athletes' village. So as a father, to see her level of independence and what I trained or not taught her in, I suppose she's travelled the world as a young girl who is vision impaired, to take on her rankings as a judo competitor, as an athlete, and to see her her trust in her team, to see her trust even in herself and what she could achieve as an athlete. And she's obviously now have a sight set on 2028, and she's uh, seen her father, I suppose, go through those similar setbacks and challenges, and she has the same philosophy, I believe, because obviously there are the facts of life where things can and will go astray, and those things could be as minor as a taxi, running late and you're missing out on a training session.
So, Gerrard, for anyone listening who feels stuck or really doubts themselves, what would you say to them to get started?
Take that first step, and that first step, no matter how small it may be, a shuffle, an inch forward. It's about recognizing what you achieved in that one step. Because when I began the Paralympic Committee, we had nothing back then. It was about having that bubble jet printer and a laptop computer. Hadn't got anywhere, but it was the first step. What did we use? My back bedroom at home, writing that first letter to the government about obviously support for the Paralympic Committee. That was another step. Third step was actually finding some free accommodation in Brisbane CBD so we could establish ourselves. That was the fourth step. So it's about identifying with those steps that we can take. And that first step for a person who may be doubting themselves, may be fearful. For example, a very, I suppose, good friend who was swimming at Yeronga, she's very fearful of the ocean. I took her out to swim mastery at Sumner Park. She's jumped in the flume there. She's developing her confidence on obviously swimming in the ocean by swimming in the flume and swimming into a current. So that's one step. So we all need to take that one step, and that first step maybe even just getting out of bed.
Absolutely fantastic advice. Now, I love to finish our conversations with the rapid fire close. The Brave Five, I like to call it. Gerrard, it's 5 questions. Don't necessarily think that one's going to lead on to the other because they're 5 random questions. First question, what is one daily ritual that really fuels your resilience?
In summer, the sound of birds, the sound of kookaburras, the sound of life, the sound of life itself. And it may not be the kookaburras, it could be the crickets, it could be the frogs, just the sound of movement.
Second question, a moment you felt pure joy during an adventure.
I think when we look at, for example, Dancing with the Stars, and when I completed that first dance without running off the stage and smashing lights or cameras, that sheer joy of having a standing ovation on that very first dance and knowing that something that had never been done before was achieved. So that was because it was something that I'd never done before. There was moments where I ran the Melbourne 10K back in '99, I think it was, and I placed out of all the thousands of runners there in the 10K, I placed second overall, and I had no idea until sort of halfway through that where I was in the actual race, but that wasn't a major. Even though I came second, I wasn't going, oh, this is fantastic, because Dancing with Stars was something I'd never done before. That's where the enjoyment came from, achieving something that I'd never done before.
Now, what's the hardest lesson you've learned so far?
That there are many things that you can't control, that you really have to explore the things that are in your sights, excuse the pun, and identifying with what you actually can use to achieve something. So with the channel, I couldn't control weather. I couldn't control necessarily the actual pathway that the pilot took, and that's where I wrote those. That's why I wrote those recommendations. And now I have a pilot who I actually now know the pathway, and I now will identify with the conditions, and I will change the order of my guides around so that we actually blast our way across through the tides in a very early way.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
Best advice I've received. I think that the change is constant, growth is optional. In the sense that, you know, my environment as a blind person is going to be continually changing, and not being able to see it is an immense disruptor. But it's the growth I take on from those disruptors that will help me build who I am, both physically and mentally.
All right. Last question on the Brave Five. What's the next big thing on your bucket list?
Okay, so three. Obviously, I have this year. I have the Manhattan Swim, which is a 50-kilometer swim. I then obviously have backing up. So 2 weeks later, I have the English Channel. But in between that, I have a chance to race a car at Daytona, and that's with Jim Forbes and Forbes magazine. So I've got a few hot laps at Daytona, and then once the swimming's all over, is moving to that next adventure, reinventing myself as a indoor climber, a paraclimbing. So I won the national championships last year, and moving on to the 2028 Paralympic Games in Los Angeles, because I can use my skill, my previous learned skills as a climber in the indoor climbing. So many a parallel running on, but they're the adventures from an athlete perspective. From a business perspective, I have some other adventures to still yet complete.
Absolutely full of surprises, Gerrard.
Always, life is a surprise. It's just like a box of chocolates.
Gerrard, honestly, what you've shared today, it's way more than a highlight reel. It's a masterclass in, I reckon, rewriting what's possible, and a reminder that bravery, it's less about never falling and more about choosing to stand up again and again. Now, before we sign off, where can people follow your next adventure, reach out, or get their hands on some of your legendary chocolate?
So they can either follow, I have a website, which is obviously gerrardgosens.com.au. Same with obviously the Facebook. Chocolate Moments, that's because the moments that make memories, and that's chocolatemoments.com.au. And for us, it's about recognizing that obviously life isn't like a box of chocolates. It's about the ingredients that you use in your life of those recipes.
Perfect. Now, those links are going to be in the show notes for everyone tuning in. If you take anything from today, let it be this. Every extraordinary story begins with someone daring to say yes to the impossible. The real limits are almost always the ones we draw for ourselves. If you want a hit of courage for your own week, join me every Tuesday for the Bravery Digest, and we'll be back next Thursday with another guest who refused to play by the rules. Until then, ask yourself, why not you? Stay bold, stay brave, and keep chasing your own impossible.